wasn't in a good place that fall, and I say that now as a man who can sit still in his own kitchen without reaching for a wrench just to keep from thinking. Back then, I measured the day by noise. If something was rattling, grinding, hammering, or whining, I could stand myself. Silence was the part that hurt. Silence held too much of Lena in it. My name's Roy Ramsey. I turned 58 that September, and if you'd asked around Coldwater then, folks would have said I was a practical man, maybe stubborn, maybe useful with machines, probably not much for stories. That part was true. I worked maintenance at the mill for 32 years, and I trusted what I could tighten, level, grease, or square. Bearings fail, belts slip, timber swells. You diagnose, you repair, you move on. Feelings don't fit in a service manual. I spent most of my life pretending that meant feelings didn't matter. Then my wife died in April, and by the first cold rain of October, I'd learned that grief doesn't care what kind of man you were before it found you. Lena had a way of making our place feel like it had room for weather and people both. We lived on the old Ramsey homestead above Coldwater Creek, on a bench of land my grandfather cleared with a team and bad knees. The house leaned a little downhill, same as it always had, and the lower shed sat closer to the bank than any sensible person would build today. Lena used to laugh and say the whole property was a collection of nearly good ideas held together by persistence. She wasn't wrong. We had a patchwork pasture, a few apple trees that bore heavy one year and sulked the next, and 6 beehives she kept, like they were a choir she directed with smoke and patience. Below the hives she planted a strip of wild flowers along the creek bend, mostly yarrow and coneflower, and a few things I never remembered the names of, because she liked seeing colour where other people saw drainage and weeds. After she was gone, I kept the hives alive by following the notes she left in a binder on the counter. Her handwriting slanted right when she was in a hurry and went near perfect when she wanted to make sure I'd listen. Check brood pattern, don't oversmoke, feed only if needed. Watch mites after late heat. I did what the pages said and told myself it was logistics, not mourning. Same with the wildflower strip. I weeded it, mulched it, staked the little sections where rain undercut the roots, all while muttering that if I let it go feral, the creek would eat the bank faster. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was I couldn't stand the idea of anything she touched disappearing on my watch. Our son, Evan, saw that and called it what it was. Me trying to hold a whole life together with fencing staples and denial. He was 31 and lived 2 towns over. Smart kid, good electrician, better father than I ever managed to be when he was young. We fought in July about selling the place. He stood in my shop doorway with his cap in both hands and said, "Dad, you're one bad winter from getting hurt out here. Sell high, move in town, be near people." I answered like he'd insulted Lena personally. "This land's not inventory," I told him. "It's home." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, quieter, "It was home when Mum was here too. You don't have to prove anything by staying miserable." I said things I shouldn't have said. I told him he wanted the money easier than he wanted the memory. I told him if he couldn't respect this place, he didn't need to come back until he could. He went still in that way people do when the hurt lands clean. He set his cap back on his head, nodded once, and left without slamming the door. That made it worse. The truck tires on gravel faded, and I stood in the shop holding a pry bar like I'd won something. By the second week of October, he still hadn't called, and I told myself that was fine. That was what men did in my family. We cooled off, we waited. We acted like time solved what pride created. I went to work before daylight, came home after dark, and filled the in-between with chores that didn't need doing yet. I stacked next year's kindling in neat rows under tarp. I rehung the gate on the north pasture even though we hadn't kept cattle in 8 years. I changed oil in the tractor that hadn't moved since hay season. I'd stand in the doorway at night and listen to cold water running below, and the sound that once made me sleep felt like a warning I couldn't interpret. Buck stayed close. He was an old yellow dog with a greying muzzle and one ear that never sat right after tangling with barbed wire as a pup. He belonged to Lena before he belonged to me, and he had her patience for my moods. He'd follow me to the hives, sit off to the side while bees worked around us, then walk back to the porch without asking for much. Sometimes I talked to him because he didn't offer advice. We got through another day, I'd tell him, while he watched the tree line like it had answers. Not pretty, but we got through it. He'd thump his tail once against the floorboards, and that counted as agreement. The house changed shape after sunset. I don't mean physically, I mean every room held a version of her that work hours kept at bay. Her mug by the sink with a hairline crack she refused to throw out. Her jacket still on the mudroom peg because I couldn't bring myself to move it and couldn't bring myself to wash it either. Her journals stacked in a milk crate beside the fireplace. 6 years of weather notes, bee notes, seed orders, and small observations that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with paying attention. First frost touched only the lower leaves today. Buck stole my glove and looked proud. Roy smiled at supper and didn't know I saw. I read those lines at midnight with my boots still on and felt both held and accused. I slept in fragments. An hour on the couch. 40 minutes in the recliner. Sometimes I'd wake with my hand closed around nothing, convinced for one quick second I'd heard her in the hallway. Then the refrigerator would kick on. Buck would sigh from his bed by the wood stove, and I'd remember where I was. I started keeping a legal pad by the sink where I wrote down jobs for the next day. Clear ditch by lower gate, service chainsaw, scrape hive bottoms, check culvert above bend. If I had a list, I had direction. If I had direction, I didn't have to ask what came next without her. Weather turned mean early that year. 2 systems back-to-back rolled off the mountains and sat over us, dropping cold rain that soaked the topsoil and woke every seep in the hill. The clay roads went slick as soap. The creek rose an inch at a time, then 2, then enough that driftwood started collecting against the outside bend near the wildflower strip. I drove a T-post at the bank and marked the waterline in Sharpie each evening just to prove to myself I was tracking it right. Monday, it was 6 inches below the mark from spring runoff. Wednesday, it touched it. Friday, it passed it. Any sensible man would have moved the hives uphill at first sign of trouble. That's what Dale Harper told me over the fence when he came by for eggs I didn't have, which was his way of checking on me without saying so. Dale had been my nearest neighbour for 20 years, retired from county road crew, and understood stubbornness from professional experience. "You're watching that creek?" he asked, eyes on the bend. "Every day." He scratched his jaw. "Bank'll give if this keeps up." I nodded. He waited for me to add something and finally said, "Need a hand moving boxes, Holler. Don't make a monument out of work that can be done twice." "I've got it," I said. He gave me that look older men give each other when they know they're being lied to politely. "All right, but you call if it gets western." After he left, I stood by Lena's hives until dark settled in and the bees quieted. I put my palm on the nearest lid and felt the faint warmth under the wood. I remember thinking, plain as anything, that I had failed at all the big things and was now clinging to small ones because they were measurable. Keep bees alive, keep flowers rooted, keep water in its channel. Keep this place standing long enough for an apology I didn't know how to make. My chest felt tight with that old sentence that had followed me since April. I couldn't hold it together. I said it out loud once to nobody, then once to Buck, who looked up from the porch steps with tired brown eyes, and waited like waiting itself was a form of mercy. Rain started again after midnight, steady and cold, tapping the metal roof with the patience of something that planned to stay. I sat at the kitchen table with Lena's binder open to a page on fall feeding and listened to the creak grow louder in the dark. I told myself it was just runoff, just water doing what gravity told it, just another problem with a practical fix waiting in the morning. I wanted that to be true so badly I almost believed it. Buck lifted his head once, ears angled toward the woods, then settled back down with his chin on his paws. I poured coffee I didn't need, watched the porch light shine against wet boards, and waited for daylight, like it was a machine part that would finally arrive, and let me start repairing what had already broken. When grey finally showed at the window, it didn't come with sunrise so much as a thinning of darkness, and I stood from the kitchen table with my back locked up from sitting too long, and my jaw sore from clenching it all night. The coffee had gone bitter in the pot. Buck was already up, nails clicking once on the floor, waiting by the mudroom door before I even reached for my coat. The rain had eased to a cold mist, the kind that hangs in the trees and settles into your collar. And the first thing I noticed outside wasn't what I saw, but what I heard wrong. Cold water didn't sound like itself. Usually it ran fast and talkative through that bend, a steady tumbling noise over rock. That morning, it had a heavier note under it, a pressured shove, like water pushing against a shut gate. I took 3 steps off the porch and felt mud pull at my boots hard enough to make me grunt. "All right," I said, mostly to the dark yard. "Let's go see what you did." Buck moved ahead and then looked back, making sure I followed. We went down the rutted path past the hives, through the stand of alder Lena liked because it held gold leaves longer than maple, and when the creek opened in front of us I stopped so fast I nearly pitched forward. The channel was blocked wall to wall. A whole section of upper bank had let go in the night. Shale slabs lay jammed crosswise with 2 fir trunks, root balls still packed with clay, and half the hillside looked shaved raw where it had slid. Behind it, water had backed into a broad brown pool that wasn't there yesterday, rising quiet and mean. It had spread out toward the lower shed, already licking into the grass line where Lena's wildflower strip began, flattening stems and carrying loose petals in little circles like it was deciding what to take first. I stood there with rain on my face and did the stupid thing men like me do, which was start counting tasks instead of admitting fear. Clear a spill notch, pull loose debris, protect hives, move feed sacks from shed, reinforce bank by the path. The list lined up neat in my head, and none of it matched the size of what was in front of me. Buck whined once, low in his throat, then sat. "Yeah," I said. "I see it." By 6:30, I had the peavey, shovel, and a length of chain dragged down from the tractor shed. I set my shoulders to the first lodged limb and got maybe 2 inches of movement for all the strain in my arms. Clay sucked at every step. Water kept arriving from upstream with the stubborn patience of gravity. I tried attacking from the left bank where the roots were exposed, then from the right, where a side run sometimes formed in spring melt, but the slide had packed in tight, a locked puzzle of weight and angle and slick surfaces that punished every bad guess. I slipped twice before 8 and banged my shin hard enough against buried rock to sit down in the mud and breathe through my teeth. Rain beaded on my gloves. My hands shook, partly from effort, partly from the old panic that had no useful shape. I could keep engines alive through harvest season with baling wire and a borrowed bolt. I could diagnose a bad bearing by sound from 20 feet away. None of that mattered to a creek with a hill in its throat. By mid-morning, the brown pool had climbed another few inches up the T-post I used as a marker. I could see it plain. The Sharpie line from Friday was gone beneath water now, and a floating board from somewhere upstream spun in lazy half-circles near the hives like mockery. I kept working anyway. You keep working when you're scared because motion feels like argument. I levered one shale slab out and watched 3 more settle into its place. I hacked brush to open a bypass trench and had it cave in before water could claim it. I hauled sandbags from the shed and stacked them in a crescent where the bank dipped lowest, knowing full well that if the jam gave all at once, those bags would look like children's toys. Around noon, I climbed back to the porch for dry gloves and found myself staring through the kitchen window at Lena's binder still open on the table. A page corner had curled damp from where I'd set my cup down. Her handwriting looked steady in a world that had gone slant. I leaned both hands on the sink and felt that sentence come up again, the one I was tired of hearing in my own head. I couldn't hold it together. Not the creek, not this place, not my family. I said it under my breath and hated how true it sounded. Buck stood by the door and nudged my knee. "I know," I told him. "No speeches." I changed gloves, took 2 swallows of cold coffee and went back down. Sometime in the early afternoon, the woods went quiet in a way that made me stop mid-step. Not peaceful, not ordinary. Quiet like somebody had laid a hand over the whole hillside. No jays arguing from the cedar tops. No squirrel chatter. No little wing flicks in the brush. Even the wind felt pared back, moving the mist, but not the branches. All I could hear was water pressing and the dull clink of rock shifting under current. I stood in that hush with my shovel blades sunk in mud and the back of my neck prickling. Not from fear exactly, more from being noticed by something I couldn't name. I turned slow, scanning tree line, creek bend, alder shadows. Nothing moved. "Buck," I said. He wasn't beside me. He had walked upslope without me hearing him, and now he stood near the edge of the firs where the ground levelled out before the old logging trace. He wasn't barking. That dog barked at delivery vans, crows, and one time at a lawn chair that blew across the yard after dark. Now he just stood there with his tail moving low and steady, eyes fixed into the timber, posture loose as if greeting a familiar neighbour. "Come on," I called. His ears tipped toward me, but he didn't come right away. He looked back once into the trees, gave another slow wag, then trotted down to my side and leaned his shoulder against my leg for one quiet second before returning to sniff the wet gravel. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe an elk higher on the slope. Buck had never been much of a chaser. Age had softened him, that was all. Still, when I went back to levering debris, I caught myself glancing toward that same patch of woods every few minutes, waiting for nothing in particular. By late afternoon, my shirt was soaked through under the rain shell, and my forearms felt like wire rope about to fray. The jam had shifted some, not enough to matter, and the backed-up water had reached the lower corner of the shed. I moved Lena's empty supers and 2 feed buckets to the loft and set the bee smoker on a shelf higher than needed, small acts that felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. The mist thickened near dusk. Buck disappeared upslope again and came back carrying something in his mouth, stepping careful like he did with eggs. He set it at my boot and looked up at me. It was a creekstone, smooth and oval, pale grey with a dark seam running through the middle. Clean, dry almost, as if it hadn't been lying in this muck. I crouched and turned it over in my hand. "What am I supposed to do with that, buddy?" He wagged once, satisfied, and went to drink from a rain puddle. I slid the stone into my jacket pocket without thinking, and worked until the light thinned to blue. My hands had gone clumsy by then, and I finally admitted I was done for the day in any way that counted. I climbed the path with Buck at my heels, each step heavier than the last, and when I stepped onto the porch my breath caught for a reason that had nothing to do with fatigue. On the rail beside the door, centered exactly between the two posts, sat a small cross made from 4 creek stones. 2 longer ones formed the upright and arm, 2 short ones braced the base, and laid across the center were fresh yarrow stems, white heads still beaded with mist. Not tossed there, placed. Deliberate as a hand on a shoulder. I stared at it long enough for water to drip from my hat brim onto the boards. There are moments where a man can feel his mind trying to protect itself, flipping through explanations like index cards. Wind, buck, sliding branch. My own tiredness building patterns where there were none. But the stems were aligned. The stones were balanced too cleanly on a narrow rail for accident. Whoever did it had taken time in weather that made me hurry everything. I looked out over the yard. Alder leaves moved. Creek growled below. No shape in the trees, no motion except rain. I set my shovel against the wall, took off one glove, and touched the top stone with 2 fingers, like it might tip if I breathed wrong. It held. Then, because grief had already stripped me of enough dignity that one more odd thing didn't matter, I said, "Thank you," to a pile of rocks before I'd had a proper evening coffee. Buck sat down beside me, calm as church, eyes on the darkening tree line, tail thumping the porch once every few seconds like he was keeping time for someone I couldn't yet see. I stood there with my hand still resting on those stones and yarrow, listening to the creek push against its own blockage in the dark, and for the first time in months, my grief moved over a little to make room for another feeling. Not relief, not fear, just a hard, practical curiosity that wouldn't let me go inside. I carried the stone cross in both hands and set it on the kitchen table beside Lena's binder, then felt guilty immediately, and moved it back to the porch rail where I'd found it, stems and all. Seemed wrong to relocate a thing I didn't understand. I towed my boots off, poured reheated coffee, and drank it standing by the sink while Buck watched the yard through the screen. Rain stitched silver lines in the porch light. Past the hives, the alder trunks stood dark and straight, and every so often Buck's tail would tap once against the wall, like he was answering somebody. I slept in spurts that night, waking to creek noise and that heavier pressure note under it. When grey came again, I was outside before 6 with a flashlight and no plan worth naming. The cross was still there, balanced exactly as before, yarrow heads bent now but not blown loose. I looked under the rail, around the steps, into the wet grass, as if I might find a calling card from whoever had played porch decorator in a storm. Nothing but slug trails and maple leaves pasted flat. "Morning to you too," I muttered at the empty yard, and Buck gave me a look that said he had accepted stranger behavior from me before. I went down to the jam. Overnight, the water had risen another inch on my marker post, but one narrow section near the right bank looked different. A wedge of shale I'd fought for an hour yesterday had shifted out and turned almost 90 degrees, opening a little throat where current now sheared through in a hard, narrow line. I stood there with shovel in hand and replayed my last daylight minutes from the evening before. I had not moved that rock. I knew I had not moved it, because I'd thrown my shoulder into it until my left arm shook and it never gave. Around it, branches that had been interlocked were now peeled apart in 2 clean gaps, not saw-cut smooth, but broken in a way that looked directed, like somebody had braced and twisted where grain was weak. I knelt and touched one fresh break, pale wood still wet and sharp-smelling. Recent, I told myself high water had done it. Pressure finds leverage, logs roll, systems fail and reseat. I could diagram the physics if I had to, but mud held details water doesn't argue with, and right there beside my own boot tracks, deep and heel-heavy from yesterday's climb, were impressions too broad to fit any man I knew. 5 blunt toe marks. Long midfoot. Deep heel. Not one print, a run of them, each placed where footing was best along the fir roots and rock lip, in spots I had avoided because one slip would put me knee-deep in the current. I set my boot beside one and felt my mouth go dry. My size 11 looked borrowed. Buck came down the path then, carrying a strip of bark twisted tight like cord, and dropped it near my feet with proud ceremony. He sneezed, wagged, and went to sniff the edge of the pool. "Where'd you get that?" I asked. He glanced upslope toward the timber, then back to me, clearly done explaining. By the third morning of this pattern, I had stopped pretending I wasn't participating in it. I set a red apple and a thermos lid full of clean well water on the old cedar stump halfway between the hives and tree line, the one Lena used as a potting stand in spring. I placed them flat and centered, then walked away without looking over my shoulder, feeling foolish and serious at the same time. At noon, the lid sat empty and the apple was gone, except for a neat half-moon bite and stem. Could have been deer. Could have been raccoon. Could have been me losing my grip and assigning manners to wildlife. Still, the next day I left 2 apples. Work stayed hard and slow. The creek remained the main problem, and I kept at it with peavey, chain, shovel, and sore hands. But now, there was this second track running beside the first, quiet and persistent. I'd return from hauling sandbags and find a pile of wrist-thick dry kindling stacked by my splitting block, bark all facing one direction, like someone had taken care with it. I'd come out after lunch and see 3 smooth stones lined at the edge of the path where puddles were deepest, making a stepping line I hadn't put there. Once Buck brought me a feather laid across that same twisted bark strip, and I laughed out loud alone in the rain because grief had turned me into a man accepting offerings from his dog, like we were in some old story my grandfather might have told after too much coffee. The laugh surprised me most. It didn't last long, but it was real, and it loosened something in my chest that had been locked since April. That Friday, with low cloud snagged in the fir tops and damp cold settling in early, I heard a truck on the upper drive and looked up to see Dale's old green Ford rocking through the ruts. He climbed out in a canvas coat, took one look at the expanded pool below the shed, and whistled through his teeth. "Roy, that's bad," he said. "You call county yet?" "Not yet." He gave me the stare of a man counting to 10 on someone else's behalf. "Call them, or at least get your important stuff uphill. If that jam cuts loose overnight, it'll take that shed and half your bee yard with it." I nodded toward the house. "Journals are still in there, hives too." "Then you load what you can and come bunk at ours till this breaks. Marlene already said so." "I appreciate it." He stepped closer, voice lower. "I'm not asking polite. I'm telling you as your neighbor. You can't out-stubborn water." I looked past him at the hives, white boxes damp at the corners, bees tucked in against weather, and felt that old refusal rise. "I hear you. I'm staying tonight." Dale exhaled through his nose, then jerked his chin toward Buck, who stood near the fir line with his tail moving in that same low sweep. "Dog's got better sense than both of us. He keeps checking those trees." "He's been doing that." Dale followed Buck's gaze a long second, then shrugged like he'd thought better of saying whatever crossed his mind. "I'll keep my phone on. If you hear cracking or that water jumps, you call. Don't be proud and stupid at the same time." He drove off before I could answer, gravel popping under his tires. The yard settled again into mist and creek noise. I stood with my hands in my pockets and watched Buck walk to the cedar stump, sniff the empty thermos lid, then sit facing the woods. By the second week of this mess, my days had started to split cleanly into 2 states. In one, I was the same man I'd been all my life, solving what I could touch, measuring inches on a post, checking anchor points, cussing at mud. In the other, I was paying attention to signs I couldn't source, waiting for sounds I couldn't file under known causes. The strange thing was, those states didn't fight each other as much as I expected. They worked side by side. That evening the mist thickened early, blurring the far bank into layered grey. I'd been at the jam since noon, boots sunk to the ankle, trying to free a trunk pinned under shale with the chain looped twice and anchored to the old winch on my tractor parked uphill. I got enough movement to open another narrow run, then lost light before I could secure the bank. I shut down the winch, rubbed my aching shoulder and almost called it for the day. Then Buck, who had been nosing along the gravel bar, stopped and sat down facing upstream, ears forward, body loose. Not alert like a warning, expectant. I heard it 2 breaths later, not a crash, not brush tearing, but the deliberate sounds of weight placed carefully, a wet stone settling. A branch moved aside and lowered, not snapped. A low splash and pause. Another splash. I crouched behind a fringe of alder and looked through the leaves toward the far side of the jam where the channel narrowed under the slide scar. At first, all I caught was shape and contrast, something darker than the fir trunks moving against mist. Then it stepped into a gap where dusk held enough light to show scale, and every practiced explanation I kept handy fell apart in silence. He was enormous, taller than the alder tops by a head, broad through shoulders and chest, like 2 men side by side, covered in dark fur, matted darker with rain. But nothing about his movement carried menace. He stood at the edge of the backed water and tested each foothold with his toes and heel before shifting weight, like a man crossing slick barn rafters with a load he didn't want to drop. He bent, set both hands on a rounded boulder half sunk in clay, and rolled it a quarter turn with slow control, then stopped to watch what the current did. The water changed pitch, cutting through a new seam. He listened, adjusted again, and eased the stone into a notch, where it held. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and stupid loud in my ears. This is shock, I told myself. This is bad light and exhaustion, and a brain running hot on grief and coffee. I kept waiting for the shape to become stump and shadow when the mist shifted. It did not. It moved with method. It worked. He stepped sideways along the jam and lifted one interlocked limb clear, not tossing it, not breaking it for force, but carrying it 3 paces and setting it above the high water line where it wouldn't roll back. He returned, braced one knee against a trunk, and pried at a wedged slab until it tipped and dropped with a thud into the pool, opening another narrow chute. The backed water drew down a visible inch in minutes, circling faster toward that gap. Buck stood, tail sweeping easy, and gave one soft huff like greeting. The big figure turned his head toward us. Through the mist I saw eyes catch what was left of evening, amber-brown and steady. No flare, no challenge. He held that look for a long moment that felt like being measured and accepted both, then went back to the work, as if my presence had been accounted for from the start. I wanted to run. I wanted to walk straight into the creek and ask 100 questions no one could answer. Mostly I wanted to keep watching, because what stood across from me was not interested in frightening anything. He was interested in the channel, in flow, in the exact same problem that had beaten me for days. Time got slippery then. I don't know if I watched 10 minutes or 40. Dusk drained to that flat blue before full dark, and he kept moving with patient efficiency, testing, shifting, pausing to read the water like it was a machine he knew by sound. Twice he looked toward Buck, and each time Buck sat down again, calm as a dog by a stove. When he finally stepped back into thicker timber, it wasn't retreat so much as completion for the night. He placed one hand on a leaning fir, moved behind it, and the mist closed around him in layers until there was only branch and rain and creek. I stayed crouched until my knees hurt, staring at the gap he'd opened. Water tore through there now in a clean, hard line, lower than before by several inches on the marker post. Not solved, not safe yet, but changed in a way I could measure. Buck came and pressed his shoulder to mine. I put my hand on his neck and felt the warmth of him through wet fur. "All right," I said, voice unsteady and quiet. "All right. All. I saw it too." We climbed back toward the house in the last of the light, and when I reached the porch rail, the stone cross and yarrow sat exactly where I'd left them, rain-beaded and steady, like a promise made without words. I left my hand on the rail a while longer, feeling the cold stone under my fingers, and the little give of wet yarrow stems, like touching proof and question at the same time. Buck leaned against my leg, warm and solid, and the creek kept up that heavy push below us, reminding me that wonder didn't pause the practical problem waiting in the dark. I went inside, pulled dry socks from the chair by the stove, and sat just long enough to peel mud-stiff pants off my knees. My hands were trembling from the day, and when I wrapped them around a fresh mug of coffee, I noticed small cuts across my knuckles filled with creek silt. That grounded me. Cuts, mud, sore shoulder, wet dog on the rug. Ordinary things. I needed ordinary things right then. Buck lifted his head at the mudroom door, ears tipped toward the yard. Not rigid. Listening. "I know," I said quietly. "Me too." I took the flashlight and stepped back onto the porch. Rain had slackened to a thin mist, drifting sideways through the yard light. The stone cross remained steady on the rail. Out by the cedar stump, where I'd been leaving apples and water, there was a pale shape I hadn't noticed before. I walked down, boots sinking at each step, and found 3 split lengths of dry cedar kindling stacked on the stump in a tidy fan, bark side down so they stayed out of the wet. On top sat my thermos lid, rinsed clean, upside down. I stood there with the flashlight pointed at my own feet because I couldn't decide if I should laugh, pray, or get back to work. In the end, I did what I'd done all season. I moved. I spent the next hour hauling the last feed sacks from the lower shed to the loft and tightening the rope line I'd rigged from the shed corner to an anchor post up the slope, not because rope would stop floodwater, but because it might keep debris from slamming the hive stands if the bank sloughed more. Twice, while I worked, I heard that careful movement in the trees above the jam. Weight placed, paused, placed again. No crashing through brush, no bluffing noise, just method. Each time I stopped and looked, and each time I caught only dark shape shifting behind fir trunks. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was giving me room. The crux of it, for me, was that nothing in his behavior asked me to panic. If I had sensed pressure, I would have bolted uphill with Buck and never looked back. What I felt instead was the same odd steadiness Buck had shown from the start, as if we were sharing a work site with a neighbour who preferred silence. By a little after 10, the rain picked up again, harder and colder, and the top inch of mud turned slick as grease. I made one more trip to check the marker post and saw the water had climbed just enough to make my stomach drop. I shined my light across the jam and found a broad back, moving at the far side, half fog, half muscle, bent over the pinned trunk I'd fought all afternoon. He braced both hands under a limb, shifted his footing twice, and eased the limb upward while current shoved against it. He held it there motionless for several breaths, reading where the pressure wanted to go. Then he lowered it again and stepped away. Not random, not an animal blundering at driftwood. Assessment. I realized then that I'd been gripping the flashlight so tight, my fingers hurt. I loosened my hand and heard myself speak into the rain. I don't know what to call you, I said, but I see what you're doing. He turned his head slightly toward me. The light never hit his face full, but those eyes caught it anyway, amber brown and calm. He didn't approach. He didn't vanish. He just stood there and held the look long enough for the message to settle plain in my chest. I was seen, and I was not being driven off. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket and nearly made me jump out of my skin. Dale's name lit the screen. "You still there?" he asked when I answered no greeting. "Yeah." "How high's the pool?" "Up another inch, maybe 2 by morning if it keeps feeding." He swore softly, then said, "Truck's loaded. I can be up in 15. I watched the dark figure move 1 step upstream, testing footing at the edge of the current. "Don't drive in this. Road's slick, and you won't be able to do much at night." "Roy." "I mean it. I'll call if it breaks bad. I've got Buck in close and gear uphill." Dale went quiet for a beat. "You sound different." "Different how?" "Like you're not panicking." He exhaled. "All right. I don't like it, but all right. I'll check at first light." "I appreciate it." "Stay smart." When the line went dead, I stood there in rain hiss and creek roar and felt how strange that conversation would sound if I added the part about who was helping me on the far bank. I slid the phone away and went back to the shed for the pry bar. Just before midnight, I made myself come inside long enough to warm up and feed Buck. He ate, drank, then returned to the door and waited. I spread Lena's old county map on the kitchen table and traced the creek's bends with 1 finger, calculating where an uncontrolled release would cut if the jam blew all at once. The line that made most sense went straight through the lower corner of the bee yard and across the wildflower strip she'd planted by hand. I sat back and pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes until colour sparked. I remembered Lena in late May, kneeling by those flowers with dirt on her forearms, saying, "Roots hold more than soil, Roy." I'd answered something practical about erosion rates and slope angle, and she had smiled like she loved me for trying. At 1:30, I was outside again. The night had gone that rain-cold blue where edges blur and distance folds in. Mist hung low over the creek, and the yard light only made a pale tunnel in it. Buck stayed close to my knee until we reached the hives, then moved ahead, tail low and sweeping. We stopped at the edge of the bank. He was there already, waist deep in churning brown water at the jam's centre, broad shoulders angled into the current. Even from that distance, I could see how careful he was with his footing. He planted each foot like a post, then reached under the interlocked trunk with both hands and lifted. The trunk shifted an inch, slid back, and slammed against shale. He reset, changed his grip, and tried again. I scrambled downslope with the pry bar, got to the left edge of the blockage where mud held enough for me to stand, and wedged the bar under a branch cluster to take a little side pressure off. It was the smallest help in the world, but the moment the branch gave, he pulled the trunk free in 1 controlled motion and swung it downstream into a calm pocket where it lodged harmlessly behind rock. Water surged through the opening with a hard, throat-clearing rush. He didn't step away to watch his work. He turned immediately to the spill point and began placing boulders 1 by 1, not to stop the flow, but to shape it, building a staggered lip that split the force toward the deeper channel and away from the shed bank. He would set a stone, crouch to eye the run, then adjust by inches. The channel answered him each time, the tone changing from angry shove to fast, directed stream. I forgot rain. I forgot cold. I watched hands big enough to break things choose precision instead. Then Buck slipped. He had edged too near the gravel tongue where runoff sheeted over algae-slick stone, and when his front paws went out from under him, he slid sideways into the edge current. He didn't yelp, just scrabbled and spun once toward the main draw. My heart stopped so hard it hurt. I lunged, boots skidding, and before I could reach him, the big figure crossed 2 strides through waist-deep water, bent, and lifted Buck under the chest and hips like he weighed nothing. Buck went still in his grip, ears back but not frantic. He was carried 3 steps to dry gravel above the wash line and set down gently, all 4 paws placed square. The big hand stayed at Buck's shoulder 1 brief second, steadying him, then withdrew. Buck shook once, sneezed and trotted straight to me, pressing against my legs. I dropped to my knees in mud and wrapped both arms around his neck, rain and tears mixing on his fur. I couldn't hold it together, I heard myself say, the words torn out of me from some deep, old place. I couldn't hold it together. I said it again, and this time the rest came with it, quiet and shaking and true. But I wasn't alone in it. When I looked up, he was back at the channel, finishing the spillway. The pool behind the jam was lowering now in visible increments, exposing dark roots along the bank and the top row of stones at Lena's flower edge. The water still ran hard, but it ran where it belonged. The sky began to pale behind the ridge. Not sunrise yet, just that first thinning of night. He stepped out of the current and stood for a moment on the gravel bar, water streaming off dark fur, chest rising slow and even. Then he walked toward the hives, keeping a respectful distance from me, and knelt by the near stand. From the gravel he chose 3 smooth stones and set them in a small triangle near the hive legs. He reached to the side, picked a spray of yarrow flattened by rain, and laid it across the top stone. A marker, not decoration, a deliberate, quiet line between his labor and what he had protected. He straightened and met my eyes one last time. There was no demand in it, no performance, no warning, just recognition, old and patient. I put my hand over my heart without deciding to. "Thank you," I said. He turned, moved up the alder edge, and passed into fog and fir in 6 unhurried steps. Branches swayed once behind him and settled. That was all. By the time real dawn reached the yard, the creek had dropped below the Sharpie line from Friday and held steady in its banks. The lower shed stood, wet but upright. The hives were splashed at the bases and intact. Buck sat beside me on the gravel, leaning against my hip, both of us muddy and shivering and calm. I called Dale with hands that still trembled. "You all right?" he answered, voice rough with sleep. "We're all right," I said. "Jam cleared in the night, channels running clean." A pause. "You clear it." I looked at the spillway stones laid with more sense than I'd had in a week, then at the 3-stone marker by Lena's hives. "No," I said, honest as I knew how. I had help. Dale let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or might have been him deciding not to press. "I'm coming over with coffee and fence stakes. 3 days from now that bank will start slumping if we don't shore it." "Bring extra stakes," I said. "We've got work to do." Dale grunted like that settled it. "I'll be there in 20. Keep Buck out of that fresh cut. Those edges'll peel." "I will." The line clicked off and I stood with the phone in my hand, staring at the dark screen like I'd forgotten what it was for. The creek kept running, fast and sure now, no longer shoving at a barricade, just carrying what the hill had given it. Buck leaned into my leg with his full old weight, and when I bent to rub his neck, my hands started shaking again, harder than before. I had made it through funeral paperwork with a straight back. I had made it through nights in that house when every floorboard sounded like memory. I had made it through saying cruel things to my own son and pretending I was defending principle instead of defending pain. But kneeling there beside the hives Lena loved, with the water turned away and the marker stones set like a quiet blessing, I broke open in a way I hadn't let myself do. I sat down in the wet gravel and cried until my ribs hurt. Not tidy tears, not one cinematic moment. It came in waves that folded me over, then left me gulping cold air, then came again. I cried for Lena, for the spring she didn't get, for all the nights I walked room to room acting busy so I wouldn't have to say her name out loud. I cried for Evan's face in my shop doorway when I hit him where I knew it would land. I cried because something big and silent and gentle had done for me what I could not do alone, and there was no way to file that under machinery, weather, or luck without lying to myself. Buck stayed pressed against my side the whole time, patient as stone, occasionally licking rain and salt off my wrist, like he was clocking me back into the world, one small, practical detail at a time. At one point, I laughed through the crying because I heard myself say, "You're on emotional support duty now, old man." And Buck sneezed right in my face like he objected to the title. It lasted 3 breaths, that laugh, but it was enough to change the shape of the moment, from collapse to release. By the time the eastern ridge began to take on that pale iron colour before sunrise, I could breathe without hitching. I wiped my face on my sleeve, looked at the 3 stones and yarrow by the hive stand, and felt something settle where panic had been. The creek was still dangerous in its own way. Banks still slump, clay still moves. Winter still comes whether a man is ready or not. But the sentence that had haunted me had finally changed form. I couldn't hold it together, yes. That part remained true. The new part was truer. I had not been abandoned in it. I stood carefully, knees stiff, and walked the edge of the channel with Buck, checking for undercut sections and fresh cracks. The spillway was built with a mind for water. Stones staggered to split force and protect the outside bend. He had read that creek better than I had in all my years on that land. On the left side, where I'd jammed my pry bar in the night, my boot prints were still there. Beside them, deeper and wider, his tracks ran in a line that showed exactly where he had stepped in and out of current. Every print was placed where footing was safest. Deliberate, efficient, kind even in the geometry of it. I crouched and set my fingers in one of those prints, filling the space where a toe mark pressed deepest. Cold water seeped around my knuckles. I could have taken a photo then. I could have called county, called the paper, called every man who ever laughed over coffee about backwoods stories, and dared them to stand where I was standing. Instead, I just sat back on my heels and said, quietly, "This stays with me." That was not secrecy from shame. It was stewardship. What happened here had not been spectacle. It had been help. Buck wandered a few yards upstream, sniffed a cluster of alder roots, then looked back at me, tail moving low. I followed and found one more sign I hadn't noticed in the dark. The interlocked trunk he had moved was now wedged higher on the far gravel bar where spring runoff would catch it, but not where it would hurt the channel. Even his discard was placed with care. A truck engine carried up the drive, then tyres on wet gravel, and Dale's Ford appeared between the apple trees with steam coming off the hood. He climbed out, holding a thermos in one hand and a bundle of steaks in the other, Marlene's bright blue raincoat thrown over his shoulders like he'd grabbed the first dry thing by the door. He looked from me to the creek, then stopped dead at the sight of the cleared run. Well, I'll be. He walked down to the bank with that road crew gait of his, weight forward, eyes scanning angles. He didn't speak for a full minute, just studied the spillway stones, the shifted debris, the drawn-down waterline on my marker post. "Roy," he said finally, "this isn't what one tired man with a pry bar does in the rain." "No." He set the steak bundle down and poured coffee into the thermos lid, handing it to me without asking if I needed it. "You said you had help." I took a sip, strong enough to strip paint. exactly what I needed. I did. Dale glanced at Buck, then toward the fur line where mist still hung in long strips. From who? I could have dodged. I could have given him half a story and watched him file me under widowhood strain. Instead, I gave him the whole truth I could stand to say in daylight. I saw him work, I said, across that jam for hours. Last night and before, big as a loader, careful as a man setting glass. Cleared the lock point, then built that lip so the force runs center. Pulled Buck out when he slipped, set him down like he was precious. Dale listened without interruption, one hand on his hip, rain beading on his cap brim. When I finished, he blew out a long breath and looked at the marker stones by the hive stand. Those yours? No, he nodded once, slow. Marlene's aunt used to say there were old neighbours in these hills, and the rude thing was acting like we owned all of it. I waited for the chuckle, the backpedal, the anyway that would return us to accepted topics. It didn't come. He looked back at the creek. I don't need to settle every detail before breakfast. What I know is this. Water's off your shed, bees are standing, and somebody understood hydraulics better than county half the time. He picked up a post driver from his truck bed and offered it to me. Let's lock this bank before the sun softens it. We worked shoulder to shoulder through first light, driving stakes, weaving willow, backfilling with rock and brush in a rough crib along the softest section. Practical work steadied me further. Swing, plant, tamp, check level, move 2 feet, repeat. Buck patrolled between us like site supervisor, occasionally pausing at the tree line with that same calm attention, then returning to nose the mud around my boots. 3 days passed before dispatch called Dale back for a washout farther up County Road 8, and in those days, we kept rebuilding. He came each morning with tools and stories from 30 years of ditch failures, and I met him with coffee and quiet gratitude. We talked some about Lena, more than we had in months. He admitted he still spoke to his brother while fixing fence, though his brother had been gone 6 years. Doesn't mean I think he answers, Dale said. Just means some conversations don't end clean. I told him that made more sense than half the advice I'd heard since April. On the second evening after Dale left and the sky turned honey grey through a break in cloud, I walked alone to the cedar stump and set out an apple, clean water in the thermos lid, and one of Lena's late yarrow stems from the porch jar. Not as payment, not as bait, as acknowledgement. I sat on an upturned bucket 10 yards back and waited while dusk came down in layers. Jays resumed their racket in the upper branches. A squirrel scolded Buck from the fence post. The stillness that had marked those first strange afternoons was gone, replaced by normal forest business. I told myself that was right. I told myself kindness didn't create obligation. I told myself if he never appeared again, what had been given remained given. I must have sat there an hour watching mist gather over the creek. No large figure stepped into the clearing. No branch moved with that careful, heavy cadence I had learned by ear. Yet when I rose to go inside, the apple was still on the stump and the water untouched. And somehow, that felt like answer enough. The work was finished. He had withdrawn the way he arrived, without demand, without performance, leaving room for me to live my own life in the place he had helped me keep. The next morning I found broad tracks once more, but only at the far edge of the gravel bar, pointed upstream into thicker timber. There were 6 clear impressions, each deeper at the toe where the bank angled up, and then none. Not erased, just ended where fir needles took over. I stood there a long time with Buck beside me, both of us looking into trees that gave nothing back but wind and green shadow. Safe travels, I said, and felt no ache in saying goodbye, only respect. I did one more thing that day. I carried the original porch cross of stones and yarrow to the mudroom shelf where Lena kept seed envelopes, and I set it in a shallow wooden tray so it wouldn't be knocked loose by coats and boots. I left the 3-stone marker by the hives where it had been placed. One I kept close. One I left in the open. That felt like the right balance between private truth and living evidence. That evening, as rain finally gave way to clear cold, and the first stars came out over the ridge, I stood on the porch with Buck and listened to cold water run in its channel, quick and bright and unforced. The branches at the tree line were still. No silhouette waited there, no eyes watched from fog. The silence after him was not empty. It was gentle, like a hand lifted from your shoulder only after you found your footing. I stood there until the cold got through my coat and into my shoulders. Then I took Buck inside, dried him with Lena's old barn towel, and set the kettle on. The house smelled like wet wool and cedar smoke. I pulled the wooden tray down from the mudroom shelf and laid out what had gathered over those strange days. The first smooth creek stone Buck brought me, the twisted bark cord, the feather that had rested across it, and the porch cross with the yarrow now gone papery at the edges. I set the thermos lid beside them for a second, then washed it and put it back by the sink where it belonged. The lid had been a tool. The rest felt like keepsakes. Buck watched all of this with his chin on my boot, like he approved the filing system. At first light, I called the county roads office because Dale had told me to, and because I had spent enough of my life pretending silence counted as competence. A woman named Trina answered on the second ring, keyboard clicking in the background. Coldwater Spur, Ramsey Place, I said. Had a mudslide block the creek. Jam released overnight. Flows back in channel. Bank still soft on the outside bend. You requesting equipment? I looked through the window at the spillway stones, dark with morning water, and set better than any machine bucket would have done in that spot. No, ma'am, not now. Just want it logged in case we get another storm pulse. She paused. I can put in a monitoring note. If water rises again, call dispatch and don't wait on it. I will. I hung up, then called Evan and got him on the second try. I told him the bank had nearly gone and that if he could come, I could use his hands. By the time I set the phone down, there was a truck in the drive. Not Dale's. Evan's silver work pickup. Ladder rack empty. Mud up the doors. I stepped onto the porch before he reached the steps. He stopped a few feet out, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, eyes going past me to the creek and back. He looked like he hadn't slept much. I probably looked the same. You called, he said. Yeah. He nodded toward the lower bank. Dale said you had a bad one. We did. A long second passed where pride could have ruined everything again. I swallowed it. I was wrong this summer, I said. About what I said to you. About your reasons. I was hurting and I made you pay for it. Evan's jaw worked once. He looked down at Buck, then up at me. I was mad too. I pushed hard about selling because I was scared I'd get a call nobody can unmake. He pulled one hand free and rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't stop coming because of land value, Dad. I stopped because every visit turned into a fight with a ghost in the room. That landed clean, and it needed to. I know, I said. If you've got a few hours, I could use your hands on the cribbing and shed corner. He gave one short nod. I brought my post driver. By late morning, we were knee-deep in mud and work, driving stakes where the bank wanted to peel, weaving willow between them, backfilling with fist rock and brush. Evan had his mother's eye for line and my habit of checking level twice. He also had her patience, which made the day easier than I deserved. We spoke in short, practical bursts at first. Hold that end. 2 inches right. Don't overpack there, let water breathe through it. Near noon, he stood at the hive row, looking at the 3-stone marker and flattened yarrow spray that still lay where it had been set. He didn't touch it. "You put that there?" he asked. "No." He turned, waiting. I wiped my gloves on my jeans and told him, plain and full, what had happened. The stillness, Buck's calm, the move to debris, the figure at dusk, the spillway before dawn. Buck lifted from current and set down like he mattered. I did not decorate it. I did not trim it for comfort. I just gave him the truth I carried. Evan listened the way electricians listen to a panel hum, head slightly tilted, taking in what's there before deciding what to call it. When I finished, he looked toward the timberline a long while. "I don't know what category to put that in," he said. "Me neither." He gave a tired half smile. Mom would have said the category is pay attention. I laughed once, surprised and grateful. Yeah, she would. That afternoon, Dale came by with more rock in his trailer and found the two of us tamping Phil behind the willow weave. He leaned on the gate, eyes moving from me to Evan, then to the repaired channel. "Well," he said, "look at this. Ramsey men speaking in daylight." Evan grinned despite himself. "Don't get used to it." Dale snorted and climbed down to help. We worked until the sun dropped behind ridge firs and the air turned sharp. Before he left, Dale stood with me at the porch rail, hands around a coffee mug, watching the creek run true. "You remember in the rain when I started to say something and then shut up?" he asked. "I do." He kept his eyes on the water. "Marlene's aunt wasn't the only one with stories. My granddad used to leave apples on a stump above our north pasture after slides. Claimed it was manners. I rolled my eyes for 20 years. He shrugged. "I didn't say it then because I didn't want to hand you a tail when you needed a shovel. But I saw your dog. I saw your face this week. I don't think you imagined a thing." I nodded. That was enough. He never asked for proof, and I never offered any. By the following Saturday, the bank had held through 2 more rains, and Evan came back with hardware cloth to reinforce around the hive stands. We rebuilt the lower shed threshold, jacked one corner, set new skids, and moved Lena's journals from the milk crate into a sealed trunk in the hall closet, high and dry. I read labels aloud while Evan packed. Spring nectar notes, 2 notebooks. "Got it. Queen records and mite counts." He raised an eyebrow. "You really doing this now?" "Your mother would haunt me if I mixed bee records with seed orders." He laughed. "Fair." When we reached the bottom of the crate, I found Lena's old field notebook with the green elastic strap, pages swollen from years in damp jacket pockets. I opened to an entry in her tight, steady hand. "Water follows the path you give it. So do people if you're patient." I sat on the hallway floor with that line in my lap and felt the house change around me, not back to what it was, but forward into something I could live inside. That evening, Evan stayed for stew. We ate at the kitchen table that had held grief like a weight for months. Buck lay between us and accepted dropped carrots as tribute. After dishes, Evan stood in the mudroom looking at the tray of stones and bark and feather. "You keeping all these?" he asked. "Yeah." He touched the edge of the tray with one finger. "Good." He slept in his old room that night. No ceremony, no speech, just an overnight bag by the dresser and his boots by the door in the morning. It felt larger than any apology. 2 days later, I took one final practical step. I wrote a full account in a new notebook and sealed it in a manila envelope with the date, weather notes, and a hand-drawn map of the spillway. Then put it in the trunk with Lena's journals. Not for headlines, not for argument, for record. If memory softened or doubt crept in on long winters, I wanted a clear page from the man who had stood in that water and seen what he saw. I never submitted photos because there were none. I never cast a track because I chose not to. The prints washed with the next hard rain, as prints do. The strange stillness in the woods lifted, and jay chatter returned. The careful breaks in limbs weathered grey. The stepped stones by the puddled path stayed through November, then got kicked loose by frost heave and elk sign. I noted each of those things exactly as they happened, and none of them reduced what had been given. On the first clear morning after the season's first freeze, I carried an apple to the cedar stump out of habit and respect. Buck came with me, slower now, muzzle gone almost white. I set the apple down, poured clean water in the thermos lid, and waited in the pale gold light while creek mist burned off the bend. Nothing moved at the tree line except wind. I did not feel abandoned. I felt accompanied by memory in the best sense of that word. When I rose to go, I left the apple where it was and took the empty lid back to the house. At the porch, I paused by the tray, touched the smooth stone Buck had delivered on that first hard day, and listened to cold water run steady below the yard Lena planted, and we saved. I still trusted weather reports and fence lines. I still checked bolts before theories. Skepticism stayed with me. Cynicism did not. I had learned that presence can do what explanations cannot, and that some help arrives without asking to be believed, only to be honoured. I carried that forward, and I do.